We now have the pleasure of being joined by Will Desautelle, FSU beat writer for WCTV. Will, can't thank you enough for coming on the pod. How's it going today?
Doing great, Johnny. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. Happy to have you aboard. All right, Will. Well, let's hop right into it. You know, you look at a Florida State side of things, 0-4 to start the year, their worst start to a season since all the way back in 1974. What's sort of the feeling surrounding this team right now?
Well, it's actually, the locker room, you can tell there's still it's still a pretty positive atmosphere around. If you go to practice throughout the off season, there was kind of an exuberance, kind of a positive energy happening that we really haven't seen with this program since the end of the Jimbo Fisher days, and really dating back to before that, actually. And that energy has kind of kept up even with the 0-4 start, and everybody keeps asking, how are you going to be able to sustain this as the losses continue to pile up? But Mike Norvell has done a really good job. It's very clear he still has the locker room, even though his tenure hasn't gotten off to a great start in Tallahassee. But the players clearly believe in the vision he's creating, and I can only speak to this year. This is my first year down in Tallahassee, but I've talked to a bunch of people during the days of the Willie Taggart era, this 1.5 years, and then at the end of the Jimbo Fisher era, a lot of former players have gone to practice, and all the beat writers too, and all of them have just said during those last couple of years before Norvell got there just wasn't something right with the program. You could tell that there was some tension, just the culture was not great. But since Norvell has gotten here, it's kind of been a refreshing boost of energy for these players, and you can tell that they're really bought into his process. They've got a long way to go, obviously, but you can tell that they believe in the guy.
I mean, you look back at that week 1 loss, a 41-38 loss to Notre Dame, a game where FSU really sort of hung around and held their own against the Fighting Irish. So if you had to pinpoint a couple of specific reasons as to really why the tailspin since then, what would those reasons be?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, if you look at that Notre Dame Florida State game, I mean, I always point back to the Notre Dame game in 2018 against Texas, that season opener. Both teams were pretty highly sought after at the beginning of the season. Texas goes in there and wins, and because they beat Notre Dame, who's a top 10 opponent at the time, everybody goes, "Oh, Texas is back. Notre Dame's still really good." But then we find out later in the season that neither of those teams were very good. And I know Notre Dame is having a good season right now, but you can tell clearly that they're not quite as dominant, especially along the offensive line, that they have been in recent years. So that game was kind of fool's gold, and then you started to see the cracks unveil with this Florida State team, that a lot of similar issues that have been happening with them in recent years. The offensive line, it's getting better, but it's still a work in progress. They have a bit of a quarterback issue right now with Jordan Travis and Mckenzie Milton, rotating both guys in and out. Can't really seem to settle on one guy because they both have very different skill sets, and it's been difficult to balance those two things. They're wide receivers. I mean, everybody talks about how much the offensive line has struggled at Florida State in recent years, but the wide receiver group has not been very good either in recent years. And then one of the biggest things this year for Florida State is just the explosive plays that the secondary is allowing in the passing game. I think right now, coming into this week against Syracuse, they've allowed, I think, 18 pass plays of over 20 yards, which I think is near the top in the country. And other than last week in the second half against Louisville, they've really struggled to keep receivers in front of them for big plays, and that's really hurt them. You saw the end of that Jacksonville State game, I'm sure. It's very odd play there. Jacksonville State's got the ball on their own 41-yard line, and rather than going to full prevent defense, they have a couple of guys press up only about 10 yards away from the line of scrimmage because they wanted to take a couple of underneath routes away and try to prevent a setup for a game-winning field goal. But instead, a receiver gets past Jarvis Brownlee, one of FSU's corners, who's really struggled in coverage this year, and the rest is history. And then some poor tackling there, and Jacksonville State goes on to winning the game. And I mean, even if FSU had won that game, you could still tell that there were some cracks within the team. But if they had gone on to win that game, I think a lot more people would be feeling less concerned about the state of the program than where we are today.
You mentioned the QB battle between Travis and Milton. Syracuse, obviously a team that sort of is in that small section of teams as well that has two QBs
Right.
They're comfortable rolling out there. Garrett Schrader getting the start last week for the Orange, with Tommy DeVito staying on the sidelines for the duration of the game. So from an Orange standpoint, it seems like maybe a decision has been made, at least in the short term. Do you get that sense from an FSU side of things as well, or is this still really anyone's job for the taking after a poor start?
No, not necessarily. Last week Mckenzie Milton took all the snaps, but that was really out of necessity. Jordan Travis left the Wake Forest game the week before with a shoulder injury, kind of held on to the ball too long. That's been one of his weaknesses throughout the past couple of years. He tends to hold on to the ball too long, can scramble around a bit. He's so athletic, and a lot of times it works out for him, but there are other times too where he can hold on to the ball too long and take big hits or not go through his reads quick enough. So he has been banged up a little bit at times over the past couple of years. So with Travis being out last week, they went to Mckenzie Milton the entire game. Milton has started the last 3 games for him, but again, like I said, 2 guys with very different skill sets. Milton has played a lot of college football, obviously. He was a 3-year starter at UCF before the gruesome leg injury he had at 2018 there. But where he excels is scanning the field, being a precision passer underneath and in their intermediate routes. Where Travis is really good is he's a dual threat guy, super athletic guy, struggles a bit to throw the ball under pressure and get through his reads, but when he has a clean pocket, he throws an excellent deep ball too. So it's, like I said, it's been a difficult balance for Mike Norvell and the offensive coordinator, Kenny Dillingham, to balance these 2 guys' skill sets. So when both of them have been healthy, they've kind of been rotating series, except for last week. Milton took all the snaps, but I'm not sure if Travis is going to be available this week, but you really don't know how these quarterbacks are going to be used on a week-to-week basis.
How much strain has that put on the running game? Is there a sort of sense that because you don't necessarily have that alpha male QB1 that you can rely on, you need production out of the backfield? I mean, obviously, Jashawn Corbin, Trayshawn Ward, 2 guys worth keeping an eye on. Do you get the feeling like they've really sort of had to pick up the slack offensively with the lack of production from an aerial standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. Corbin and Ward, no question, have been the 2 best players on this Florida State offense. I think Jashawn Corbin, he's leading the ACC in yards per carry right now with over 9 yards per attempt, and Ward's not too far behind them, I think at about 6.5. And again, they haven't been running behind a very good offensive line. Now, here's a crazy stat about them. So I forget the exact number, but they're one of the top teams in the country. Florida State is at runs of 20 yards or more, but on runs that they don't go 20 yards or more, they're averaging only 3.01 yards per carry. Now, what does that tell you? It's because they're getting hit a lot at the line of scrimmage. So if the offensive line can open up a hole for these guys and allow them to get out in space, good things are going to happen for them, but that hasn't consistently happened enough. But like I said, Trayshawn Ward, Jashawn Corbin, these 2 guys have been excellent so far this year.
The offensive line struggles for the Seminoles have certainly been there. On the flip side of that, the Syracuse defense has 39 tackles for loss so far this season, a number that's towards the top of the nation. Do you get the feeling that that's sort of where this game is going to be won or lost if the FSU O-line can be up to the task and stave off what's been really a red-hot front 7 for the Cuse?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Syracuse is top 2 or 3 in both tackles for loss and sacks. So, I mean, albeit maybe you can speak to this more, but I know Syracuse hasn't played stellar competition through the first 4 games. I know Liberty last week going up against Malik Willis, one of the best quarterbacks in the nation. They did a pretty good job on. I know he threw the ball efficiently, but I think they held him to, I think only about 2 yards per carry on about 17 rushing attempts. So this Syracuse defensive front, they're no joke. I mean, you saw last week against Liberty, they were consistently able to get penetration, keep Malik Willis off his spot. And that's going to be a challenge for Florida State. They have struggled to consistently do that to opposing defensive fronts. And again, if they can just get the ball out in space to these guys like Corbin and Ward, allow them to get in space and make some plays, then that's when they've been at their best. But they've been better in pass protection over the past couple of weeks. You look at Mckenzie Milton. I think when he was able to, when Louisville rushed only 3 or 4 guys last week, he was able to scan the field well, go through his progressions, and he probably had his best game throwing the ball last week. But FSU is still a very young group. They've had they've really lacked continuity as well. They've had a lot of injuries. Their starting right tackle, Robert Scott, was out for a couple of weeks. Their starting center, Maurice Smith, has been out for the last few weeks. And their top interior reserve, Dante Lucas, he left the program a couple of weeks ago. So it's not a very deep group right now for Florida State. And because of that lack of continuity, it's been a difficult task for them to, you know, to achieve any consistency. And their offensive line coach, Alex Atkins, excuse me, he said a couple of weeks ago after practice that he's never seen this many guys go down with injuries or slash opt-outs, I guess, in Dante Lucas's case, this early in the season in his entire career.
So that's the offense. From a defensive standpoint, Jermaine Johnson has been making things tough with 5.5 sacks on the year so far. I'm really interested to see, if the Sean Tucker show for Syracuse really rolls on. Obviously, he's been turning a lot of heads out of the SU backfield. Do you get the sense that from a defensive standpoint, that's priority number one for the Seminoles this week, to minimize Sean Tucker's impact on this game through guys like Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at Florida State's defensive performance last week, it was a tale of two halves. They allowed 31 points, I think 316 total yards, and I think 8 of 10 third down conversions in the first half against Louisville last week. But then the second half, they allowed 0 points, only 79 yards, and held Louisville to just 1 of 8 on third down. And that started with being able to keep Louisville's quarterback, Malik Cunningham, in the pocket and not extend plays. And dual threat quarterbacks like what you're going to see with, I don't know, you can probably speak to a bit more of the quarterback situation with Syracuse, but Garrett Schrader's a similar guy, probably not as athletic as Malik Cunningham, but he's going to present similar challenges for this Florida State defense, a guy who can extend plays from the pocket, be a threat to run on the ground. And he's the type of quarterback that Florida State has struggled with in recent years. But like you said, Sean Tucker, I think, has been Syracuse's best player on their offense so far this year. And I watched the game against Liberty last week. He's a tough runner. I really enjoyed watching that game, just watching him run all over the Liberty defense. So Florida State's going to have their hands full. They got a couple of young linebackers still who are still developing in DJ Lundy and Kalen DeLoach, namely. But it's a very good defensive front. Last week, they didn't have Fabian Lovett, one of their top interior guys, and you could feel the void that he created, the void he left in that first half against Louisville last week. They were just able to do whatever they want up front. Malik Cunningham had all day to throw and play action, and they could create some explosive plays down the field. But then in the second half, for whatever reason, they started to get more pressure. Jermaine Johnson had a sack in there too. And last week, Johnson, I thought Louisville did a really good job of taking Johnson out of the game for the most part. I know he had a sack, but it was probably his quietest game of the year so far. So I'm very interested to see how Syracuse tries to neutralize him.
Anyone from an FSU side of things that maybe isn't getting the attention in media this week that Syracuse fans maybe aren't all too aware of, but they really should be come Saturday?
That's a good question. I'll go with the guy I just mentioned, actually, Fabian. Well, I'll stay on the interior of the defensive line, actually. I mentioned Fabian Lovett, who was out last week. He's probably their best interior defender all around, but another guy on the interior of the defensive line who has played really well, and especially last week in an increased role with Lovett out, is Robert Cooper. He's been, for Pro Football Focus, one of the best run defenders along the defensive line in the entire country this year. So he's going to be a critical piece in slowing down Sean Tucker and Garrett Schrader in the Syracuse rushing attack, I think.
All right, well, last one I got for you. If FSU is indeed going to stave off an 0-5 start to the season, it would be because...
I think it's got to start with slowing down this rushing attack with Tucker and Schrader. I think Syracuse doesn't have a very dynamic passing attack. I know Florida State's secondary has struggled, but just when I've watched Syracuse over the past couple of weeks, it doesn't look like they have a ton of dynamic threats on the outside. So, even though Florida State's cornerbacks have struggled a bit, I don't think that should be a huge problem for them. The key for them is just going to be to remain disciplined, not allow any of these guys to get over the top for any freebies. So I think because of that, they're going to be able to allocate more resources to the run game. And if they can slow down Tucker and Schrader in this rushing attack, then they'll give themselves a pretty good chance to win.
All right. Well, there you have it. Will Desautelle, thank you so much for coming on. Will, really can't thank you enough, and appreciate all the insight as always.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Johnny.